We took the job in late autumn, when the soy fields had already been cut down to stubble and the wind came flat across the land with nothing to stop it. The farm sat off a county road that barely showed up on maps, 3 barns, a milking shed, and a collapsed farmhouse that leaned the wrong way. A developer had bought the property after a foreclosure and wanted everything cleared before winter. Old equipment, scrap, rotted lumber. Easy money for a week of work. That was how it was sold to us. The smell hit first. It drifted out of the open barn doors and hung low like it had weight. It was not rot and not manure. It was sweet and sour at the same time, thick enough that it coated the back of my tongue. It reminded me of silage left too long, mixed with something sharp and chemical. We stood there with our hands on our hips, breathing through our mouths, telling ourselves that farms always smelled wrong if you were not used to them. Inside, the barns were empty of animals, but not empty of use. Feed bins were still half full. A rusted tractor sat with its key still in the ignition. The floors were swept in some places and gouged in others, as if something heavy had been dragged again and again along the same path. There were no nests, no signs that raccoons or birds had moved in. The place felt paused instead of abandoned. The milking shed was worse. The smell pooled there, trapped by low ceilings and closed windows filmed over with dust. The stalls were bare, hoses coiled neatly on hooks. In the center of the floor, where cows would have stood shoulder to shoulder, chains were bolted into the concrete. Thick chains, the kind used for towing, sunk deep with anchors that were newer than anything else in the building. The metal was clean, not rusted through like the surrounding fixtures. There were scratches around them, shallow grooves cut into the concrete, fresh enough that the dust had not settled inside. 10 years shut down, the paperwork said. 10 years, and these marks looked like days. I tried to explain it away as leftover equipment, some farmer's idea of securing a pump or a gate. But there were too many spaced wrong, positioned where animals would have been forced to stand. There was dried residue on the floor that was not oil and not manure. It flaked when I scraped it with my boot and left a chalky smear. We worked until the light went thin. We hauled scrap into piles, stacked boards, loaded the trailer. Every time the wind shifted, that smell followed us. It clung to our clothes. By evening, my head ached from it. We set up in a camper we had parked by the tree line, far enough from the barns to feel like a boundary. I washed my hands twice and still smelled it on my skin. That night, I lay awake listening to the farm settle. Metal clicked as it cooled. Somewhere an unsecured door banged in the wind. Sometime after midnight, I heard something else. A low scrape, slow and uneven, coming from behind the nearest barn. Not footsteps, not machinery. It sounded like weight being pulled over dirt, stopping, starting again. I told myself it was a tarp or a loose sheet of metal. When I checked the clock, hours had passed without me noticing. In the morning, frost rimed the grass. The yard between the barns was a pale crust that held prints clearly. My cousin was already up, standing quiet with his hands in his pockets, staring at the ground. Boot prints crossed the yard toward the back fence. They were his size. Same worn heel, same split at the toe. They went straight, then veered, then stopped halfway across open ground. There was nothing there. No scuff, no drag mark past that point. Just clean frost. I followed the prints back with my eyes, then turned to him. He was beside me the whole time, from when we woke to when we stepped outside. He had not gone anywhere alone. He swore later that he had heard the same dragging sound and thought it was me checking the trailer. I did not tell him I had heard it too. We stood there longer than made sense, the cold seeping through our boots, trying to force an answer onto the ground. We kept working because that is what you do when you're paid by the day. We avoided the milking shed at first, stuck to the barns. The smell grew stronger as the sun warmed the place. Flies came out of nowhere and hovered low, lazy despite the cold. In the far stall of the largest barn, behind a stack of broken pallets, we found a section of wall that sounded hollow when I knocked on it. The boards were newer than the rest, nailed and clean. When we pulled them away, there was a narrow room built between studs, hidden from the aisle. Inside were buckets, stained cloth, empty feed sacks repurposed for something else. The floor was dirt, tamped down hard, with grooves that matched the scratches in the shed. That was when the shape of it started to make sense. This was not farming. This was keeping, holding, moving things through a place meant for animals because it was already wired, already plumbed, already isolated. The chains were restraints. The scratches were resistance. The smell was a mix of disinfectant and decay and fear layered over time. Behind a milking shed, where the dragging sound had come from, the ground dipped slightly. We found a length of steel cable half buried, leading toward the tree line. It ended at a winch bolted to the back of a rusted truck hidden under branches. The engine was seized, but the winch handle moved, fresh grease on the gears. Nearby, the earth was disturbed, a long, shallow trench that had been filled and packed down. Not deep enough for anything permanent, deep enough to hide something until you could move it again. The boot prints made sense too. They were not new. They were from the day before, laid down when frost was already forming, then preserved by shade. Overnight, someone had dragged something heavy across the yard, smoothing the frost where the cable ran, erasing tracks beyond a point. In the morning light, what remained looked impossible if you did not see the whole picture. We did not find anyone alive. We found evidence of people passing through, of someone living in the margins of the farm for a while, sleeping in the hidden room, eating from the feed bins, washing at the hoses. We found blood soaked deep in the wood where it could not be scrubbed out, hair caught in bolts, teeth marks on the rubber lining of stall. We found a ledger and a coffee can buried by the fence, names reduced to initials, dates, weights, notes that matched nothing legal. The explanation was ugly but plain. The previous owner had not gone bankrupt from bad crops. He had been running something that needed privacy and infrastructure, and when it went wrong, he walked away and let the bank take the shell. Someone else had come back after, using what was left until the pressure grew too much and they left too, cleaning just enough to slow discovery. We called it in. The site filled with vehicles that did not belong on a farm. The developer stopped answering calls. The barns were taped off. We gave statements that felt thin even as they were true. No one asked about the dragging sound. No one argued about the boot prints once the ground was measured and the cable matched the marks. Weeks later, after the soil tests and the dig, they found remains where the trench had been. Not one. Enough to explain the ledger. Enough to explain the smell. The case closed the way these cases do, with charges attached to names that had already left the county, with headlines that used words like suspected and alleged. I still smell that place when the weather turns. Sweet and sour, carried on cold air. It is not fear of the unknown. It is the knowledge of what fits cleanly into the shape of a farm when someone decides to use it wrong. I grew up on my dad's cattle farm, flat land stitched with fence lines and windbreaks, the kind of place where sound carried clean and far at night. That year we had 86 head, mostly cows with late calves, and everything ran on routine. Feed at dawn, check water, mend fence, count heads twice. When I was 19, the house had a mole problem that spread fast through the walls, so I moved into the old room above the barn. It was a narrow space with a low ceiling and a single bulb that hummed. From that room, I could hear every shift of weight below me, every cough, every hoof fall on concrete. Pen C sat at the far end, against the north wall where the fence met the barn siding at a sharp corner. It held the youngest calves, still small enough to bunch up when they were scared. Around 2:10 a.m. every night, they started bawling all at once. It wasn't hunger or sickness. I had grown up with those sounds. This was panic, thin and sharp, cutting through the dark. It woke me out of a dead sleep the first night, and every night after that. I would pull on boots and go down the stairs, careful not to turn on the overheads yet. The barn smelled like hay dust and warm animals. When I reached pen C, the calves were pressed tight together, heads lifted, eyes fixed on the empty corner. The fence there was intact. The wall showed nothing but old scuffs from years of rubbing. The dirt at the base was churned, marks like pacing, but there were no clear tracks. I stood there long enough to hear my own, breathing slow. When I flipped the light on, the calves settled, not all at once, but enough that the noise dropped back to normal barn sounds. This pattern set in quick. Always the same time. Always pen C. Always the corner. I checked for drafts. I checked for loose boards. I checked for snakes, raccoons, stray dogs. We had coyotes on the back pasture. Sometimes they howled close enough to raise hair, but coyotes stayed outside. The barn doors were shut at night. The pens were latched. The calves didn't scream when coyotes passed the fence line. They screamed at that corner. One morning, I found a calf dead. It was lying on its side, legs folded wrong, neck bent at an angle that made my stomach drop. There was no blood. The eyes were open and dull. The ground around it was scuffed, but again, no clear prints. The fence showed no break. I lifted the calf's head and felt the give where the spine met the skull. It was a clean injury. Dad said coyotes. Coyotes tear. Coyotes leave signs. Coyotes don't bend a neck like that inside a locked pen. I started sleeping with the light on. The bulb hummed and pulled bugs to the window, and the room never went fully dark. I told myself it was for studying, but I kept my boots at the foot of the bed. The calves still bawled, but less hard, like the edge had been taken off. When I went down at night, the dirt in the corner showed fresh marks some nights and none on others. I began to notice details I hadn't before. The latch on Pen C's gate sat a little higher than the others, as if it had been lifted and set back. The dust on the top rail was wiped thin in one place, like a hand had rested there. The barn had a catwalk above the pens, used years back for throwing hay down into mangers. It ran along the wall and ended near that corner, where a ladder dropped to the ground. I climbed up one afternoon and walked it slow. The boards creaked under my weight. At the end, the wall met the roof truss, leaving a shadowed pocket where dust and feathers collected. I found a cigarette, but crushed into the wood, old but not rotten. No one in my family smoked. I told myself it could have been from years ago, from someone else, from anywhere. Still, I swept the catwalk and left the light on at night. The next calf died 2 weeks later. Same injury, same pen. I checked the locks twice a night after that. I set up a trail camera, aimed at the corner, tied high on a post. The next morning the camera was on the ground, strap cut clean. The cut was straight, not chewed. The memory card was gone. I felt cold then, not scared the way movies make you scared, but alert like a switch had been thrown. This was not animals acting on instinct. This was something that knew the place. I stopped sleeping much. I kept notes in a notebook, times and details, trying to make sense of patterns. The calves always started first, then the older cows stirred. The noise never reached the house because the windbreak blocked it. From the room above the barn, I heard everything. I watched the yard lights from the window and learned their reach. There was a dead zone by the north wall, a strip of shadow that stayed dark no matter how bright the bulbs burned. One night, I stayed up. I sat on the catwalk with the lights off, just the moon through the high windows. The barn settled around me. At 2:10, the calves tensed, a ripple through the pen, then the sound rose. In the corner, the shadow shifted. Not a shape moving fast, just a change, like someone stepping into a darker patch. I smelled something sour and human, sweat gone stale. I didn't move. I watched the shadow lean over the fence. The calves surged back, pressing into each other. The shadow reached down. I heard a small crack, sharp and final, and the sound stopped from one spot. The rest of the pen kept bawling. I didn't chase. I didn't shout. I went down the ladder and hit the lights. The shadow was gone. The calf lay still, neck bent. The gate latch was set back in place. The dirt showed a long scuff, heel dragged toward the ladder. The explanation came later, slow and ugly. The farm had hired a drifter this summer before to help with fencing. He slept in his truck for a while, then disappeared without asking for pay. After I left for college, Dad found signs in the barn loft he never used, a bed made of feed sacks, empty cans, rope. When the farm sold, the new owner tore out the old siding on the north wall. Behind it was a crawl space big enough for a person to move through, connecting to the catwalk. There were bones tucked into the insulation, not just calves. The sheriff traced the rope fibers and the cut strap. The drifter had a record for livestock theft and animal abuse, moved from county to county, using barns like shelters. He killed calves fast and quiet, practiced hands, taking meat later when the place was empty. He knew lights and routines. He stopped when I left because the light stayed on and the noise changed. He moved on. Dad sold the farm after 7 more losses, spread over 2 years, always the same injury, always at night. He never slept easy there again. I don't blame him. When I close my eyes, I still see that corner, empty and dark, and the way fear moves through a pen when something human learns how to hide. We were 5 broke students with more curiosity than sense, the kind that turns empty places into temporary homes. The farm sat beyond a line of poplars, the driveway chewed down to dirt by years of rain and tires. Locals said it had been empty since the 80s. No power lines, no animals, no one paying attention. That was enough for us. We parked behind a collapsed fence and walked in with packs, keeping our lights off until the barn took shape against the sky. The barn was tall and leaning, red paint flaking to gray. The lower doors were chained but rusted open with a shoulder. Inside it smelled of dust, old feed, and rot that had gone dry. The hayloft ladder was still there, its rungs worn smooth. Up top, the floor held. The loft stayed dry and caught the breeze. We spread sleeping bags between broken bales and settled in, satisfied with the height and the view through slats that looked out over fields grown back to weeds. Before dark, I walked the perimeter. Corn grew in a field beyond the barn, too neat to be wild. Stalks stood in rows that bent at the edges where animals had pushed through. The cobs were small and uneven, the leaves tight. Someone had planted it years ago, or someone had kept it going. The house across the yard had caved in on one corner. Windows were black holes. The well cap was gone. There were paths through the grass where feet had gone often, narrow and pressed flat, leading between barn, field, and a line of trees. Night fell clean and cold. Wind slid through the boards and made the loft creak in small ways. Mice moved in the walls. I lay awake listening to the field breathe and the barn settle, telling myself the noises were normal. Around midnight, the sound below us changed. Not scurrying or fluttering. Footsteps, slow and heavy. Each step took time, heel to toe with a pause between. The rhythm was wrong for us. None of us walked like that. The steps stayed under the loft, circling, stopping near the ladder, then moving away. Then came chewing. Wet, steady chewing. It had weight to it, jaw working, saliva pulling back into the mouth. It carried in the open space, not loud but clear. The smell came next, green and sweet, the sharp scent of crushed corn. The chewing went on for minutes. I counted breaths to keep from moving. The loft boards pressed against my ribs. The ladder creaked once, not from climbing, but from a hand resting on it, a test of weight. I watched the square of darkness at the ladder opening and waited for a head to rise. It did not. The steps moved out toward the open doors. The chewing followed. Wind came in and the barn breathed again. I did not sleep. When dawn lifted the dark, pale and thin, the barn looked ordinary. Dust floated in the light. We climbed down together, stiff and quiet. At the base of the ladder, fresh corn cobs lay stacked. Not tossed, not scattered. Stripped clean and placed end to end, 6 of them, their silk pulled off and set aside. The curls were gone down to white. The stalks outside showed breaks at the same height, snapped by hands that knew where to pull. The ground held prints, not clear but deep where weight had pressed. The prints ran barefoot in the dirt, toes spread, heel worn smooth by miles. They led from the field to the ladder and back again. We checked the doors and the yard. No vehicles. No trash, no tools left behind. The house showed signs of use that did not belong to a party. A corner room had a mattress on the floor with a blanket folded clean. A shelf held jars of water, capped and dusted. There was a bucket by the well rope. The paths through the grass made sense now. The cornfield was tended just enough. Whoever it was had been there a long time. On the drive back, fields sliding past the windows, the image that stuck was the one seen at dawn. A figure stood at the edge of the corn, skin pale against the green, wearing no shoes. He did not wave or hide. He watched the barn until the sun cleared the trees, then turned and walked the path into the woods. The explanation settled heavy and simple. The farm was not empty. It had been lived in quietly by someone who kept a routine, who ate what he grew, who knew the sounds of the place, and assumed the loft would be empty at night. We had climbed into another person's shelter. The steps were slow because age and hunger make movements careful. The chewing was wet because fresh corn is wet. The latter was tested because height matters when bones break easily. The stacked cobs were not a threat. They were order, habit, and a message that food had been taken where it always was. We left with the windows down and did not look back, because once the reason was clear, fear had nowhere to hide. COVID year. Everything shut down at once like someone flipped a breaker. The warehouse laid me off first. The cafe followed. I burned through savings fast. Rent didn't pause just because the world did. When an orchard job showed up online, cash pay, on-site trailer included, I took it without thinking. It was far from town, tucked between low hills and windbreak trees, the kind of place you only notice if you're looking for it. The orchard was old. The trees were planted in long, careful rows, trunks thick and scarred, branches heavy even before harvest. Apples still hung green and tight when I arrived. The ground smelled sour and sweet at the same time, rot mixed with fertilizer. The trailer sat at the edge of the property, close enough to see the first row, but far enough that the rest blurred into shadow by evening. The owner met me once, mid-afternoon. He stayed near his truck, never stepping fully into the rows. He showed me how he wanted the pruning done, which trees to ignore where the tools stayed. He paid me the first day in cash, counted it slow, folded it neat. He left before the sun dipped behind the hills. After that, I didn't see him past dusk. Not once. The trailer was small, dented aluminum, thin walls. It held heat during the day and lost it fast at night. I slept light there, partly from the cold, partly from the quiet. Orchards are never truly silent. Leaves shift, insects move, distant animals pass through. But there was a weight to the night that pressed in like being watched without eyes on you. The first night, I heard apples fall. No wind. The air was still. The sound came clear and close. Thud, thud, thud. Each impact was dull, heavy wet. Apples don't usually drop like that unless they're rotten or pushed. These sounded solid. I waited, counting my breaths. Nothing else followed. No rustle, no footsteps, no branches shaking. Just silence. In the morning, I walked the row nearest the trailer. 3 apples lay beneath one tree. They weren't bruised much. Their skins were clean. When I picked one up, it felt warm. Not sun-warmed. It had been cool all night. This warmth was different, shallow, uneven, like it had been in someone's hand. I told myself it was nothing. Heat from fermentation. Some chemical process I didn't understand. I was tired and hungry and scared of losing work. I kept pruning. The second night, it happened again. Thud, thud, thud. Same spacing. Same pause between each sound. Always 3. I checked my phone for wind reports. Nothing. The branches outside the trailer window didn't move. In the morning, I found 3 more apples. Warm again. All from the same height. All clean. I noticed something else then. The ground beneath the tree was scuffed. Not like from falling fruit, but like from a shoe-toe dragging. I stayed alert after that. I marked time by light, not clocks. The owner never came back in the evenings. No vehicles passed the road after sunset. I started sleeping with the trailer light on. It didn't help. By the 4th night, I was awake when it happened. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed, boots on, listening. The first apple hit. I stood. The second hit. I reached the door. The third hit. I stepped outside. The air was cold and flat. The orchard stretched out in rows that looked endless in the dark. My light swept across trunks and branches. Nothing moved. No animals broke cover. No birds scattered. 3 apples lay under the same tree as before. Still warm. I didn't sleep after that. The days blurred together. My hands cracked from sap and disinfectant. My shoulders burned. I stopped venturing deep into the orchard. I worked the rows closest to the trailer and left the rest untouched. The owner didn't comment. He came once more, mid-afternoon, counted cash into my palm, left early again. The 5th morning, rain had fallen overnight. The ground turned soft. Mud clung to everything. I noticed the steps to the trailer were marked. Bare footprints. Big ones. Heels deep, toes spread. No boot pattern. No shoe tread. They came from the orchard, stopped at the steps, then turned back the way they came. I stood there a long time, staring. The prints were fresh. They cut sharp into the mud. Whoever made them hadn't slipped. They had stood steady, close enough to touch the door. That night, the apples fell again. Same rhythm, same count. I didn't go outside. I stayed still until morning. In the light, I walked the row and looked closer. I followed the ground. The scuffed earth formed a path, faint but clear once I knew what to look for. It led deeper than I'd ever worked, past trees marked with old paint, past a low shed I'd been told not to open. Behind it, the ground dipped. Mud pooled there, thick and dark. There were more footprints. Bare, too large, the same size as the ones on my steps. They circled the tree where the apples kept falling. The branches above showed signs of strain, bent downward, leaves crushed and bruised. Someone had been climbing. The warmth made sense then. Apples held against a body don't cool fast. Tossed down one by one, spaced out. 3 at a time. I checked the shed. The door wasn't locked. Inside were old crates, stained and broken, and a mattress pushed against the wall. It was damp, flat, and used. Nearby sat a plastic jug, empty, and food wrappers, all generic, all recent. Someone had been living there. I thought about the owner's timing, about him never staying late, about cash payments, about how quickly he told me which areas not to touch. The orchard wasn't just neglected. It was shared. The last day, the owner came early. He didn't ask questions. He didn't look surprised when I stood farther away than before. He counted out more cash than usual and sat on the hood of his truck. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. His body stayed angled toward the road. I took the money. I packed fast. I didn't clean the trailer. I didn't finish the rows. I left tools where they were. As I pulled away, I saw movement near the trees. A shape stepping back into shadow, bare skin against bark. Someone who had learned the orchard better than I ever did. I didn't argue. I didn't come back. The explanation was enough. Hunger, isolation, and an owner willing to look the other way had put someone out there at night, testing boundaries, letting me know they were present without crossing a line that would force attention. The apples weren't a threat. They were a signal. I understood it too late, but understanding was enough to leave. My brother bought the farm because it was cheap and because he thought isolation meant peace. The land sat high in the hills where the road narrowed and the air stayed thin even in summer. Old fence lines cut across grass that never quite grew thick. The house leaned into the slope as if it had settled there by mistake. The listing mentioned goats, a spring-fed trough, and a view. It did not mention how quiet the place could get. He called it a goat farm, but it was a patch of hillside with a pen, a shed, and animals that looked alert all the time. The goats were not skittish. They watched every movement with square pupils that never softened. They were fed well and kept clean. The pen gate was heavy and looped with chain. The chain ran through an iron bolt sunk deep into a post that had been there longer than the house. He showed me the setup when I arrived, proud of the work he had done to make it secure. He pointed out the lack of tracks each morning. No disturbed soil, no torn grass, no signs of struggle, just one goat missing every few nights. He had been sleeping badly. I could see it in the way he moved and the way his eyes followed the pen, even when he tried to focus on other things. He said the goats made noise sometimes, but not the normal kind. He said it like a fact and then stopped talking. I stayed because he asked me to, and because I wanted to believe there was a simple reason. Animals vanish on farms. Fences fail. People steal. The hills hide things. That evening the air cooled fast. The light slid away from the slope and left the pen in shadow while the ridge still glowed. Insects buzzed low. The goats settled and chewed. The house creaked, as it always did when the temperature dropped. I lay on the couch with a blanket and listened to normal sounds. Wind through dry grass. A bird shifting on a beam. The faint clink of the chain as a goat leaned against the gate. Sleep came in pieces. The place had a way of pulling me awake. At some point, the insects faded. Not all at once, but as if a hand turned a dial. The wind stopped moving the grass. The silence was not gentle. It pressed. I noticed it because it felt like a change in pressure. My ears rang. Then the goat screamed. It was not bleeding. It was high and sharp and layered, many throats at once, then fewer than one long sound that cut off. The noise lasted long enough for my heart to lock and my muscles to tighten, and then it ended. The quiet that followed was complete. No insects returned. No wind came back. The house stopped creaking. Even the distant road, far below, offered nothing. I lay still because moving felt wrong. My breathing sounded loud in my head. I waited for the next sound and counted seconds without knowing why. Nothing followed. After a while, my body cooled and my pulse slowed enough for thought. Whatever had happened was over. Whatever it was, it did not linger. Dawn arrived gray and low. Mist clung to the slope and flattened the world. The pen came into view slowly, posts and wire appearing like shapes in fog. I walked down with the same care used on ice. The ground showed no sign of disturbance. No torn sod, no drag marks. The chain hung exactly as it had the night before. The gate had not been opened. One goat was missing. The remaining animals stood apart from each other. Their eyes were wide. Their coats were clean. There was no blood, no hair caught on wire. The trough water was still. The feed bin was untouched. The count was short by one, and the absence felt heavier than the presence of the others. I checked the posts. I pulled on the chain until my hands hurt. It held. I followed the fence line with my eyes and found nothing bent or broken. The hillside fell away behind the pen into a narrow draw, choked with brush and rock. The ground there was hard and dry. No tracks showed. The goats did not approach the gate. They faced away from it, bodies angled toward the slope as if the land itself had offended them. We searched the rest of the day. The shed held tools and hay and no secrets. The spring ran clear. The woods below were open enough to see a body if one lay there. Nothing did. By afternoon, the insects returned. The wind moved again. The place seemed ordinary. That made it worse. I stayed another night because leaving felt like quitting too early. The second night passed without incident. The goats made small noises. The chain clinked. The insects hummed. Morning brought no loss. That did not bring relief. It felt like waiting between storms. I began to notice details I had missed. The fence along the back of the pen rose higher there because the ground dipped. The wire spacing was wide enough for a head to fit through. The posts were old but solid. The brush below showed paths that were not obvious from above. I saw a scat near a rock, dark and full of hair. It had been there before, and I had stepped past it without thinking. The explanation came together without comfort. A large cat had been using the draw as a travel corridor. The hills supported them, though people rarely saw one and spoke of them only when livestock vanished. A cat could climb the fence where it rose higher. It could reach through wire with a paw. Panic would do the rest. Goats crush and pile. One could be pulled against the fence, neck caught, body lifted. A clean kill would leave little sign if the animal was carried off in one piece. The screaming would be brief. The silence after would be shock, both animal and place reacting to a sudden stop. The chain gate meant nothing to something that never touched it. I left after that. My brother sold the land within a month. He did not argue with the price. He did not keep any of the animals. He returned the tools to the shed where they belonged and locked the house. He never went back. He does not talk about it now, not because he believes in something unreal, but because he learned how thin the line is between what feels safe and what simply has not happened yet. I inherited my uncle's wheat farm in late spring. The paperwork finalized 2 weeks after the funeral. He had died alone in the house, face down on the kitchen floor. The report said heart attack. He was 68, lean, strong for his age, the kind of man who woke before sunrise without an alarm. I accepted the explanation because it was easier than asking why a man who checked fences twice a day would collapse 10 steps from his back door. The farm sat miles from the nearest town, bordered by scrub trees and a shallow drainage canal that only held water after storms. The house smelled like dust and old cooking oil. His boots were still by the door, caked with dried mud from different seasons. The first night I slept there, I could hear the wheat brushing against itself, a dry, constant sound, like paper being handled somewhere far away. I had grown up visiting during summers, but owning it felt different. The land pressed in on me. It felt watched, not in a mystical way, but in the way open fields make you aware of how exposed you are. The northern field lay beyond a low wire fence and a strip of hard-packed dirt road. That field had always been his best. Even as a kid, I remembered it standing taller, darker, fuller than the rest. On my second day, while cleaning out the house, I found the journals. They were stacked in a milk crate under the workbench, wrapped in plastic grocery bags. Spiral notebooks, cheap paper, all written in the same narrow handwriting. Dates ran back 15 years. At first, the entries were normal. Rain measurements, seed types, fertilizer ratios, notes about birds, pests, machinery issues. Then the tone shifted. He started writing reminders to himself instead of records. Keep it fed. Don't let it cross the fence. Burn if needed. Watch the north line. I assumed it was shorthand for crop management, maybe a joke he kept with himself. Farmers talk about land like it's alive. Still, the repetition bothered me. Page after page mentioned the northern field. He tracked its growth separately. He noted how it responded differently to the same treatment. Same seed, same fertilizer, different result. When I walked that field during daylight, it looked good. Too good. The stalks were thicker, the heads heavier. The soil underfoot felt softer, damp even when the rest of the farm baked dry. I knelt and dug with my fingers. The earth smelled sweet, almost fermented. I told myself that meant nutrients, good microbial activity. Nothing wrong with that. I found a fence post along the north line reinforced with extra wire, replaced more often than elsewhere. It had driven them deeper, packed stones at the base. On one post, I noticed black scorch marks near the ground. Control burn, I thought. Stubble management. That night, I woke up around 2 to the sound of wind. The house rattled lightly. I lay still, listening, until I realized the sound didn't match the trees. The wind was blowing from the south, steady, but the wheat on the north side hissed louder, faster, like something moving through it. I stood at the window and watched moonlight slide across the field. The stalks bent in a line that cut against the direction of the wind. Not all at once. It moved gradually, like pressure traveling through water. I told myself it was a downdraft, a temperature shift, something I didn't understand yet. I was tired. I went back to bed. Over the next week, I worked the rest of the farm. I repaired equipment, cleared brush, checked irrigation. Every morning, the northern field seemed to have grown overnight. It leaned toward the fence, heads heavy, stalks bowed. Some had crossed the wire, pushing through, snapping it loose. I cut those back and reinforced the line. I reread the journals more carefully. He wrote about yield, about selling grain he didn't remember harvesting. He wrote about feeling watched while working the north line, about pressure in his chest when he stood too long in the field. He mentioned headaches, tremors, trouble sleeping. He blamed mold spores, dust, heat. He noted that burning reduced the symptoms for a while. I sent a soil sample to a lab. While waiting, I walked the field again. In places, the wheat grew so dense, I had to push through it. The stalks scraped my arms. The air felt thick, humid, though the day was dry. I felt lightheaded after a few minutes and stepped back out, blaming pollen. The lab results came back with elevated alkaloid levels. Ergot contamination. The technician explained it in clinical terms. A fungus that infects grains, thrives in damp conditions, produces toxins. Can cause hallucinations, muscle spasms, heart issues if ingested or inhaled over time. Historically known. Manageable if caught early. Burn infected fields. Rotate crops. Drain excess moisture. I sat at the kitchen table with the report and the journals spread out in front of me. Heart attack. Pressure in chest. Tremors. Hallucinations. My uncle had been feeding something without knowing it was feeding him back. That night, the wind picked up again. I stood outside this time, boots on dirt, watching the field. The rest of the farm moved as expected, waves rolling with the breeze. The northern field lagged, then shifted in a different pattern. A tall shape passed through it. Not a figure, not separate from the plants, but a path of movement where stalks bowed and sprang back. Like someone walking, but heavier, slower, wider. I didn't think monster. I thought of air density, of heat rising unevenly, of the way dense crops can channel wind. I thought of my uncle, standing here alone, breathing this in year after year, his brain filling in shapes where there were none. I also thought about the lab report. The next morning, I called the fire department and filed for a control burn. I followed protocol. I waited for the right conditions. Low wind, high humidity. I plowed fire breaks along the fence line, widening them until bare dirt showed. When I lit the edge of the field, the fire caught fast. Too fast. The wheat burned hot, flames climbing higher than expected. Smoke rolled thick and dark, carrying a bitter smell that made my eyes water. As the fire moved inward, the sound changed. Not roaring, but popping, cracking like damp wood. I watched until nothing stood but blackened earth and drifting ash. The fence posts remained, scorched but upright. After the burn, the land never recovered. I replanted with clean seed, adjusted drainage, treated the soil. The wheat came up thin and pale. Yields dropped across the entire farm, not just the north. The soil tests improved slowly, but something had shifted. The ground stayed dry now, even after rain. The richness was gone. I sold the next harvest at a loss and put the farm up for sale the following year. Before I left for good, I walked the northern field one last time. The fence stood intact. The ground was hard. Nothing moved unless the wind pushed it. In the house, I packed the journals into a box and left them on the table for the next owner. Not as a warning about something alive, but as a record of what happens when a man works alone too long, breathing in poison, letting patterns form where none exist. The official cause of death still says heart attack. I don't argue with that. I know what ergot does to the body over time. I know what isolation does to the mind. I burned the field because it was necessary, not because I was afraid of it crossing the fence. Sometimes, though, when I smell smoke or hear grain moving in the wind, I remember the way that wheat bent against the breeze, and I understand why my uncle wrote the way he did. Not because there was something out there, but because the land had already crossed into him, and he didn't know how to fence that off. I took the lease because it was cheap and because I wanted distance. The farm sat high enough that the road vanished after the last bend. Wind pushed up from the valley and stayed all day. The previous owner had died alone in the farmhouse. No family came to claim anything. The agent said the sheep and fences were still in good shape. That was true at first glance. The land rolled north to a shallow dip where a spring fed the old concrete trough. That trough was the first problem. The flock learned the routine faster than I did. They moved with the light, grazed until heat built, then drifted south towards shade. They drank from the southern trough and from a plastic tank I set near the shed. They would not drink from the northern trough. Not once. I watched them stand with their noses over the water, lips twitching, throats working. They backed away and crowded the grass instead. Thirst did not matter. Heat did not matter. I scrubbed the trough until my hands burned. I drained it and let it refill. I replaced it with a new one and hauled it into the same spot. I dragged that 120 feet east and then back again. It made no difference. They acted like the water burned. I assumed disease. I pulled samples. Nothing showed. I assumed smell. I blamed iron, algae rot. I ran fresh pipe and let it flow for hours. The water stayed clear and cold. The sheep still refused. I kept notes, dates, weather. Nothing lined up except that they avoided the north end after dark. I did not blame them. I felt watched up there too. That part of the field dipped just enough to hide movement. The fence ran old wire and posts cut from local timber. It leaned in places. I planned to replace it before winter. The nights were quiet in a way that rang. Wind thudded against the house and then stopped. Owls cut the dark. I slept light. I woke often with the sense of someone walking the perimeter. I told myself it was the flock shifting. She'd make more noise than people think. The wandering started in late summer. You drifted north at dusk and did not turn back. I followed with a headlamp and a rope. The beam caught her near the fence. She stood stiff, neck straight, legs locked. Her eyes were rolled back, so far the white showed. Her breathing came fast and shallow. Foam wet her lips. The grass around her lay flattened in a wide circle, pressed down as if something heavy had rested there for a while. The smell hit thin, sharp and sour, not manure. More like sweat soaked into wool. The fence behind her bowed inward. The wire hummed when the wind hit it. I did not touch the ewe. I cut the fence and backed away. She broke free on her own and ran south until she hit the flock. She stayed off feed for days after. I walked the circle in daylight. The ground held deep marks that did not match sheep or deer. Two narrow impressions paired close together, sunk deep at the toe. No heel mark. They pointed toward the fence and then away, like steps taken carefully. I told myself it was erosion, a trick of light. I filled the marks and tamped them down. The next week I found the same circle again, fresh near the trough. The water was low. A film clung to the sides, clear but thick. I scooped it with a gloved hand. It stretched like sap and snapped back. I drained the trough and capped the pipe. The sheep drank from the south and crowded the tank. They lost weight. I fed more grain and watched for illness. None came. I began to notice tracks along the fence line at dawn. They appeared and vanished. Too deep for a man walking flat, too narrow for boots. I paced them. The stride was short and even. The depth suggested weight held forward. I checked my boots against the prints and felt foolish doing it. I searched the shed for old gear from the previous owner. I found snares, rusted and illegal, stuffed behind a beam. I found a set of leather gaiters reinforced with hard tips shaped like split hooves. They were cracked with age and darkened by use. They fit over boots and extended the toe. I did not put them on. I wrapped them and locked them away. Sleep came in fragments. I woke one morning to marks outside my bedroom door, pressed into the dust I had tracked in. 2 narrow points per step, close together, sunk deep. They faced the door and then turned away. No drag marks, no hesitation. I stood there until light filled the room. The prints led to the kitchen, then to the back door, then vanished at the threshold. Outside, the ground was too hard to hold them. I packed that day. I cut the lease the next morning and moved my things before noon. Before I left, I walked north one last time. I found a blind set into the dip, hidden with brush. Inside were food wrappers and a bottle that stank of sweat. The ground inside was pressed flat in the same circle I had seen near the ewe. The trough pipe had been opened and closed again, the thread scarred. The spring was not poisoned. It had been fouled on purpose again and again, with a substance that smelled like human waste mixed with grease. Enough to keep animals from drinking without showing up at tests. The explanation settled into place with a weight that made sense. The previous owner had been running traps and snares. He had used the gators to move among stock without spooking them, to test fences, to scare them away from the north end while he worked. Someone else had learned the routine. A poacher or a squatter had moved in after the death, using the blind, fouling the water to control the flock, crouching in the grass to wait. The narrow, deep prints came from a man walking on reinforced toes, weight pitched forward to keep balance. The circles came from long waits. The ewe had blundered too close. The marks at my door were a test, a warning, a way to see if I would react. I locked the house and drove out with the windows down. At the bend, I stopped and looked back. The north field lay empty and still. Nothing moved. That did not comfort me. The sheep gathered at the south fence as I left, thin but alive, facing away from the trough they would not touch. I handed the keys back and did not argue the fee. The farm stayed empty after that. The agent told me later the water problem vanished when the trough was removed and the dip filled in. No one mentioned the blind. No one mentioned the gators. I did not bring them up. I had already learned enough. I spent the summer working alone on my uncle's farm, a small, run-down property in the middle of central Pennsylvania. The fields were overgrown in places, the fences sagging, and the barn leaned slightly to one side, as if it were tired of holding itself up. The air carried the sharp smell of hay mixed with manure, and even at dawn, a fine layer of dust clung to everything. I arrived early, when the sun was still low, painting the horizon in pale pinks and yellows. The quiet was absolute, only broken by the occasional crow or the soft rustle of wind through the corn. There was a rhythm to the farm, a slow pulse that set the pace of everything. I had grown up around farms, but this one was different, older, quieter, and it demanded attention in a way that made you aware of every sound, every movement, every detail. The first few days passed in a kind of meditative routine. Mornings were spent feeding the animals, hens, a few cows, a single goat that wandered more than it should, and cleaning stalls. I became familiar with the sounds, the low moo of the cows, the the clucking of hens, the scrape of the shovel against the barn floor. Everything had a pattern, and it was comforting in a dull, mechanical way. In the afternoons, I worked in the fields, walking rows of corn that rose above my head, pulling weeds, fixing broken sections of fence. The sun was relentless. It baked the dirt into a hard crust, and by the third day, my hands were raw and blistered. At night, I slept in a small room above the barn. The boards creaked under my weight, and the wind whispered through gaps in the siding. But the quiet, the isolation, was almost easier to handle then, when the farm itself seemed to inhale and exhale in the dark. On the fourth day, I noticed something strange in the east field. One of the fence posts had splintered, the wires sagging in a way that made the boundary look like it had been breached. I didn't think much of it at first. The weather had been windy, and some of the fences were old. When I went to repair it, I saw tracks in the dirt, fresh, running along the fence line. They weren't human. The impressions were irregular, wide in places, deep. I paused, looking over the field. Nothing moved. The corn swayed gently, casting long, thin shadows in the fading light. I assumed it was a deer, or perhaps one of the cows had escaped, though the tracks didn't match theirs. I fixed the fence, making sure it would hold, and dismissed it. The farm had its quirks. I had grown up learning to ignore them. By the sixth day, the feeling had started to creep in. It was subtle at first, a sense that I was being watched, a prickling along the back of my neck whenever I entered the barn. I chalked it up to being alone for long stretches of time. The animals acted normal, though they were quieter than usual, heads low, eyes tracking movements in ways I hadn't noticed before. I started to notice small things out of place. A bucket turned over where I didn't leave it, a rope line coiled differently, the feed trough slightly less full than I remembered. Nothing that made sense. No doors had been opened, no footprints inside the barn. I told myself it was my imagination, the solitude playing tricks. The next day, I arrived at the barn just after sunrise. The air was crisp, carrying the smell of wet earth and frost. I noticed the cow in the back stall was restless, pawing at the floor. The goat had pressed its head against the wall, ears flat. The hens huddled in a corner, their feathers puffed out. I walked through the barn slowly, checking stalls, counting animals. All were accounted for, though the uneasy feeling deepened. When I stepped outside to check the east field, I froze. The tracks I had seen before were back, but this time they weren't just along the fence. They cut diagonally across the field, leading toward the small woods at the edge of the property. I followed them cautiously. The ground was firm from the early frost, and every step brought a hollow echo. The tracks stopped abruptly at the tree line. I scanned the shadows. Nothing moved. I backed away slowly, the hairs on my arms standing on end. For the next couple of days, the unease grew. I started noticing subtle changes I couldn't explain. Tools weren't where I left them. The animals were jumpier, more skittish. At night, I heard noises outside the barn. Soft scraping, something heavy being dragged across dirt. I would sit in the dark, listening, straining to identify the sound. It never repeated in the same way, and when I checked, the barn was always empty. I began sleeping lightly, waking at odd hours, catching glimpses of movement at the edges of my vision. On the ninth day, I went to check the perimeter fence. The post in the east field had been completely broken, splintered into pieces. The wire lay twisted on the ground. I felt my stomach tighten. This wasn't wind, this wasn't an animal. I walked slowly around the field, scanning the corn line and the tree line. The tracks were back, fresh, wide, deep, leading into the woods. I realized then that someone had been here, moving through my uncle's land while I slept, while I worked. I felt the full weight of the isolation, how exposed the barn and fields were, how vulnerable I had been for days. I spent the day repairing the fence, moving slowly, deliberately, while keeping my eyes on the tree line. When evening fell, I left the barn doors open and the lights on, though there were no bulbs, just the dim glow from the farmhouse in the distance. I positioned myself in the loft, high above the barn floor, where I could see the entrances. Hours passed. The wind moved through the corn and around the barn, carrying sounds, rustling shadows. And then I saw it, a figure, tall, thin, moving slowly at the edge of the tree line, watching the barn. I froze. It didn't move like an animal. It paused, shifted, disappeared behind the trees, reappeared a moment later, always just at the edge of sight. I realized it had been here all along, moving silently across the fields, leaving tracks, watching the animals, leaving the little signs I had dismissed. I stayed in the loft until dawn, heart pounding, listening to every noise. The figure didn't come closer, didn't attempt to enter the barn. When the first light broke across the fields, it was gone, vanished into the woods as silently as it had appeared. I climbed down carefully, checking every corner, every stall, every shadow. Everything was intact. The animals were safe. The fence was repaired, and the tracks led only to the tree line, stopping there. I left the farm the next day, telling my uncle I had finished my work early. He didn't ask questions. I didn't volunteer details. I could feel the eyes of someone else still on the property as I drove away, a presence that had moved unseen through the fields I thought I controlled. The memory stayed with me long after. The quiet that had carried the weight of watching, the subtle signs I had missed, the understanding that the isolation of the farm had not been solitude at all. It was exposure, vulnerability, and the realization that someone, or something human enough to leave traces, had shared that space with me, unseen, silent, and deliberate. The farm looked the same from the road, the barn leaning, the fields golden under the sun, but I knew it had a shadow I could never ignore. I bought the farm in late autumn, a small stretch of land that had been on the market for years. The house was old, 2 stories of faded white paint and sagging roof, sitting at the end of a gravel road that curved through cornfields and scrub. The previous owner had died in the winter, alone, and the real estate agent spoke around it in careful sentences. I didn't mind. I was drawn to isolation, to the quiet, and the way land can feel separate from the rest of the world. The first day I walked the property, I noticed how uneven the fields were. A shallow depression ran along the west side, collecting rainwater until the soil turned thick and sticky. The barn leaned slightly, doors stiff with rusted hinges. I stepped inside and smelled the must of old hay, of animals that had long since been gone. The stalls were empty, cobwebs hanging in the corners. I spent hours sweeping and inspecting the structure, checking beams for rot and the floorboards for weakness. By dusk, I could see the first stars peeking through the bare branches, the air cold and still. I started with the east pasture, a gentle slope of grass with fences mostly intact. The previous owner had left some equipment behind, a tractor that roared to life after an oil change, a mower with dull blades, a collection of hand tools covered in dust. As I walked the perimeter, I noticed an uneven line where the grass seemed pressed down, not flattened by wind or rain. It ran diagonally, from one fence post to another, in a straight path that didn't match any tracks I could imagine. I dismissed it at first, thinking a deer or raccoon had wandered through. Nights were quiet, except for the occasional owl or the scrape of branches against the roof. I slept upstairs in a small bedroom with a single window facing the pasture. On the second night, I woke to a sound that made me lie still in the dark. Something was moving in the field. Not animals, not wind. The grass shifted in a line, long and deliberate, bending as though someone were walking through it slowly, even though there was no wind. I watched for a long time, heart racing until my eyes ached. By morning, the impression in the field was still there, a faint groove in the grass that I could trace with my fingers. I spent the next day repairing the fence along the west pasture, thinking that maybe the land slope had trapped water and caused the grass to grow unevenly. But nothing explained the path. I measured, checked soil density, dug small holes to see if there were burrows. Nothing. The earth was normal, yet the impression remained, as if someone had walked there carefully and deliberately, leaving no footprints, no sign of passage beyond the bent grass. Weeks passed. I worked the land, clearing brush, fixing the barn roof, planting winter wheat along the edges of the fields. The groove in the west pasture returned after every rain. It didn't fade. Each time I inspected it, I felt the same weight pressing down, not fear exactly, but the sense that the land remembered something, that it had its own pattern I couldn't control. I began to notice small signs. Fences twisted in ways they hadn't been, hoof prints that didn't match any animals I'd seen, tools slightly out of place after I'd set them down. I checked locks, left gates latched, and yet the disturbances continued. I tried to convince myself it was animals, nocturnal creatures using the depression along the slope as a path. But the tracks never matched anything I could identify. They were too wide, too uniform. The grass bent in ways that no animal could, as though something had passed with deliberate weight distributed evenly across its length. I began to dread walking the pasture at night, staying in the house after sunset, listening to the soft scrape of something moving. In late winter, the snow came. It fell heavily, covering the ground in white, filling depressions and flattening the grass. I watched from the window, expecting the snow to hide the path. But when the snow melted, the groove reappeared. Clear, sharp, straight, exactly where it had been before. My hands ached from checking the ground, from trying to find a cause. I considered hiring someone, a tracker, a local farmer with experience in animal patterns, but I didn't want anyone else seeing it. I felt possessive of the land, even of the strangeness that lived there. I began to study the surrounding fields more closely. The neighbors' crops grew evenly, their fences stayed intact, their animals followed simple paths. The difference was stark. Something about my farm seemed to resist explanation. I took notes, photographed the groove, measured the width, compared it to nothing I could find in reference books. The more I watched, the more I felt the land shaping itself independently of me, of the tools I used, of the care I tried to give. Spring arrived. I planted a new section of wheat near the west slope, hoping the growth would be uniform. For a week it was, then I noticed subtle shifts. The stalks leaned slightly, forming arcs that seemed unnatural. I measured wind direction. It didn't match. I walked the perimeter, checking soil and moisture. Everything was normal, yet the bending continued, small at first, then more pronounced. The path reappeared in the grass I hadn't planted, cutting across the field in a line so straight it seemed impossible. I realized the pattern was permanent, recurring, tied to the land itself. There was no intruder, no animal, no machinery malfunction. It existed as a part of the farm, a record of movement over time, embedded in the soil and grass. I felt the weight of it, a pressure that pressed against my chest when I walked near it. I tried to work around it, avoid it, plant elsewhere, but the influence extended. Crops near the groove grew unevenly. The soil drained differently. The field resisted cultivation in subtle ways I could not overcome. By midsummer, I made a decision. I cleared the west pasture completely. I tilled the soil, burned the remaining stubble, scattered lime and fertilizer. I replanted carefully, row by row, trying to erase the impression. I watched as the wheat grew, straight and pale, lacking the vibrancy of the rest of the farm. It was fertile, but it had no life of its own. The groove was gone, the field obedient but dull. The rest of the farm never returned to the same rhythm. Crops grew, but unevenly. The barn seemed quieter, the air less alive. I understood then that the land had always carried memory, that the groove was not something external, but an imprint of years of growth, of care, of patterns my eyes could not comprehend. By reshaping it, I had imposed my control, but at the cost of its vitality. I sold the farm the following year. I left the house empty, the barn stripped of old tools, the fields freshly tilled but pale. I told the buyers nothing unusual. The land looked normal, productive, tidy. Yet when I drive past now, I sometimes see the west slope, the pale wheat swaying uniformly in the wind, and I remember the groove, the way it persisted without explanation. I understand finally that some patterns cannot be erased. The land keeps them, and we are only temporary visitors, unable to fully know the shape of what we inherit.